One of our most popular episodes to date was going over how to evaluate cards for Limited. If you haven't seen that, check that out in the link above or in the description below. In this episode, we'll cover how to evaluate the Aetherdrift cards. In particular, the traps that cause people to underestimate or overestimate certain types of cards. We have 21 traps that we'll run through fast-paced for a quick, high-value episode. So let's get rolling. We'll start with the cards people overestimate, and first up will be a type of card most prevalent to Aetherdrift. Cards that require other cards just to function, like vehicles. Vehicles aren't really a creature on the board. For that piece of cardboard to function, it requires tapping another actual creature on the board, and not only just for offense, but also for defense. Limited is all about board presence, and in particular, getting creatures on board. Sure, we love cards that scry to when they enter, but not at the expense of not adding a creature to your board, or removing a creature from your opponent's board. It's also looking like the optimal number of vehicles to include in your deck is low at 2 to 3, with maybe 1 or 2 more if they can crew themselves or come with a creature or some significant enter the battlefield ability. So you'll really want to be picky about your vehicles. Speaking of cards that don't impact the board, we have cards like Alacrian Armory. Yes, this crews vehicles, gives your board vigilance, and adds toughness, but it technically doesn't add a creature to the board. Judge such cards harshly. They are much better if they add board presence in some way, even if it's only adding a 1/1 token. While board presence is good, board presence with no power is not. 1 power is far better than 0 power. This is especially true in Aetherdrift, as 1 power creatures can significantly help with crew costs. But even outside of crewing, the 1 power is often enough to join in on double blocks and threaten to kill your opponent's attackers. Don't get distracted by huge toughness creatures when their power is 0. Your opponent can get around these without worry by going wide or flying over them. Speaking of low power, low toughness is often an underestimated liability. You can have lots of power, but if your creature trades down with a 1 or 2 drop, it's not great. Much of Magic is winning on the mana cost front, and in that sense, you're usually trading down with cards that are greatly unbalanced on power and toughness. You usually prefer your 2 drops as 2 2s, 3 drops as 3 3s, 4 drops as 4 4s, etc., since they're much less likely to trade down on mana. Likewise, high mana cost creatures that can easily be removed cheaply are a liability. Sabotage Strategist is great when it survives, but essentially all removal kills it, even for 1 mana. Watch out for any creatures with mana cost 4 or greater, with 2 or less toughness, and no reasonable ETB ability. While mana is important, it matters how quickly you get it, because the use of it compounds over turns. Cards that don't ramp you by turn 3, like Point the Way, should be judged harshly. The pilot lands will see some reasonable play, but I think people are likely to overestimate them or put them in the wrong decks. With Exhaust, there's a lot of good mana sinks in the format, and in such formats, you rarely want to be sacrificing your lands, especially for what is essentially just a 1/1. Sometimes early defenders can be a roadblock to buy you time to do more controlling actions like ramping, but such defenders with low toughness should be scrutinized. Against aggro decks, these are reasonable at slowing the game down. However, decks are much stronger when they can respond to either side of who's the beatdown. It might be the case that your opponent can be even more controlling than your control deck, and you need your creatures to be able to threaten damage. Defenders like Ticket Tortoise can't do this. Cards that often miss are a liability. Admittedly, this card got me. I first graded it as one of Black's top 2 uncommons, and then rechecked how many instants and sorceries there are in Aetherdrift, and there's not much. There's about 2/3 the instants and sorceries compared to most sets. While this card reads much better than Sin Collector from Pioneer Masters, it'll actually hit less, and when this card misses, it's really bad. Perhaps the most debated card type I put on the overrated list is Graveyard Recursion. Graveyard Recursion is fun, but rarely good. At 5 mana, you'll typically want your Recursion to be instant speed, so that it really is a 2-for-1 that can eat your opponent's attackers by surprise. If it's sorcery speed, you'd usually rather just play a great 5-drop as the threat, rather than rely on setup to get something more expensive than 5 CMC into your graveyard just to recur it. Admittedly, this set has cycling on some powerful vehicles and creatures, and it's possible Graveyard Recursion will be better than it has been in the past. So I'm prepared to be wrong on this take in this set, but this episode isn't meant to be set specific, and in general you should be skeptical of expensive Graveyard Recursion. Up next, we'll go over the cards that people underestimate. But right before we do that, we need to ask you to please like and subscribe. We went nearly 2 months on Pioneer Masters, an arena-only set that had really low viewership, and it really hurt us on the YouTube algorithm. So please, help us grow again by hitting that like button and subscribing to encourage us to keep making this content. Now on to the cards that people underestimate. And up first are cards that are tricks and permanents in one. You can only draw so many cards in Limited, and it's helpful to think about, is this effect worth a card? That's why many 1-drops aren't playable. They aren't worth a card. Tricks are usually printed to be reasonable. They're worth a card because they can usually cost your opponent a card in combat. However, it takes setup and you could be blown out. Tricks that come on permanents, on the other hand, have a good shot at being a 2-for-1. So be on the lookout for cards like Fang Guardian. They're better than people usually rate them. On the theme of 2-for-1s, cards that provide some board presence impact while drawing a card are usually good. Take Transit Mage, for example. Yes, 3 mana for a 2-2 is underrate, but drawing an additional card more than makes up for the low power and toughness. It's similar with Tempo. Unsummon is reasonable, often costing your opponent a turn, and sometimes costing them a creature in combat with some setup. But the bounce effect isn't superb because you're down a card when compared to your opponent without that setup. Cards that bounce and draw a card, like Roadside Blowout, make up for that and are usually underrated. With, for example, cards like Spike Shell Harrier, which I hear is being referred to as Blue Shell as a Mario Kart reference. These bounce a creature, add to the board spells are great, and this card will be amongst Blue's best uncommons. Creatures that enter the battlefield with another creature are also great. You'd rather have stats split up amongst multiple creatures than on a single creature. It protects your value better from removal and also gives you flexibility to block in more favorable ways. Cards that die into more creatures can also be underestimated. Admittedly, triggers on death cards are sometimes overestimated because your opponent will just go out of their way to ensure your creature doesn't die before you do, and therefore you don't get the value. However, on cheap cards like 1-drops, it's very easy to get the value off of it. Cheap cards that add to the board while scrying or surveilling are great. That early card selection sets up the rest of your game plan and can turn what would otherwise be mulligans into keeps. Loot effects also really help smooth out your hand. I thought Dreadwing Scavenger would be good in Foundations, but I didn't think it'd be a bomb. Similarly, I misgraded with Cancel in that set. My learning was to not underestimate loots. Hand fixing is not too much worse than card draw. Cards that are powerful late but have a 1-mana cycling buyout are often underestimated. The 1-mana cycling part is key. You can usually find 1 mana mid-game to cycle these cards while still adding to your board on the same turn. The same can't be said of 2-mana cyclers. Cards that stabilize your board and gain life on ETB can be good. Admittedly, I'm not as high on migrating Ketradon as many others because I prefer my large creatures to have trample or vigilance. And cycling 2, like we said, is expensive to cycle in the early game, which is when you'd want to cycle this card. That said, this type of card usually plays pretty well, and these type of cards should not be underestimated. If you haven't seen our episodes on mana fixing, you really should. Check those out in the link above or in the description below. While not the sexiest part of Magic, mana bases are what often determine wins and losses. Pretty much any draft where I didn't end up with at least one form of fixing, I'm disappointed. And Night Market is an early pick that can play in any deck. That's all for today. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next when Aetherdrift goes live on Arena.